So I'm Matt Litton. I'm a Trevecca author, and it's really cool to be here and talk to you guys tonight. I graduated from Trevecca in 1996, and I've got some funny stories about that. I played basketball in Cincinnati, and it's March Madness, and we're here to talk about a basketball book. And so I wanted to play college basketball really bad. I was an all-city basketball player in Cincinnati. And so I went looking for colleges, and my dad drove me down to Trevecca, and I think Frank Wilson was the coach back in '91. And so I got a tryout with Coach Wilson, and I did okay, and he offered me a little money, a little scholarship money to play basketball, and so I thought, wow, I'm really excited. And so that's how I ended up at Trevecca, actually. But my dad had played on the very first Trevecca basketball team in 1968 and '69, so that was one of the reasons I ended up here. But I spent about a year or two playing basketball in college and quickly realized that was not my thing. You know, my career should have ended in high school. And so I returned to Trevecca, graduated in '96, and I studied English and religion, and I graduated, and you know, what are you going to do with an English and religion degree? I worked in publishing for a couple of years and really enjoyed that. And I also did a little work in ministry, but I really felt called to work with kids. I wanted to be in the classroom. And so I came back to Trevecca again and graduated from the education program with my master's in education. And I started to teach. We moved to Cincinnati, and I was teaching high school and coaching different levels of high school basketball for 10 years. And it was kind of in that process. And I grew up in a house where, you know, we loved to read, and I always loved stories. But it was during that process of teaching that I started to write a little bit. And if you're interested in how you become a writer, you just do that by writing. And so I would write these articles and send them out to people. And finally, this online magazine called Relevant started to pick up my articles and publish them. And it was really neat because the feedback seemed to be good, and everything that I would send would get published. And I thought, I really enjoy this. It seemed to fit in the space of teaching and coaching and all that stuff. I had a national radio show pick up an article that I wrote for Relevant about Christmas, and this radio host read it on the air to several million people. And at that point, I thought, this is really neat. I mean, I wonder if I could do this for a living. And so I started thinking through, you know, the possibility of writing a book. What would I write about? Well, as a high school English teacher, your favorite novel is To Kill a Mockingbird, or at least mine was, because I grew up in a house, you know, with a high school English teacher as a mom. My dad had been a principal. And so my first thought was, what if I wrote a book that kind of shared the spiritual lessons that I learned from To Kill a Mockingbird and tried to do it in a creative and fun way that wasn't too academic. And so I set out to do that and went through this incredible experience. You know, the first time you're writing and you start with that blank page and you go through the process of discovery and trying to figure this thing out, it's exciting, you know, but it's also really hard work. It's a grind. We published that book with Tyndale Publishing in 2010, and I learned more in that experience of that first book than I could have learned in 4 books. It was really an amazing ride. Loved it so much, I thought, okay, I want to do another one. I want to do another one. And so, you know, in the middle of teaching, you know, senior English and all that stuff and coaching basketball teams, I would come home in the evening and I started to write my second book, which was called Holy Nomad. And that was published in 2012, I think, with Abington Press. And it really was just falling in love with the book writing process. And I started to look around, and the interesting thing is some of the guys that I grew up playing basketball with, they were writers too. Because, and it is March Madness, we've got to bring basketball into this, there's some similarities between writing and basketball. You know, you have to go out and you have to embrace the solitude of basketball to get better, work on the court and work on your game, and writing's kind of the same way. And so I had a friend that I played with at Olivet, and I found out that he was writing novels. And we talked about the similarities between those two things. And so really started to think, hey, I want to see if I could do this for a living. What would that look like? And so we came back to Nashville, and I had worked in publishing for a little bit in Nashville, and I began working with authors and helping them tell their stories, helping them kind of focus the message of their books and things like that. And I absolutely loved it because it combined the two things that I really like to do. It combined writing, and it had a little bit of teaching to it too, because I was guiding and directing these people. And the amazing thing about it, I had no idea. I didn't know much about ghostwriting. In fact, even when I worked in publishing, I didn't realize that a lot of these people don't write their own books. They need help with it. And so it was kind of a revelation to me. When we moved here and I began to do this, I thought, I love this. And so that's how we got here. I was doing a little bit of work here in Nashville, and one of my friends named Kyle, one of my dear friends from publishing, he was traveling and happened to have coffee with an agent as he was traveling through Los Angeles. And this agent had this great story. And this is several years back. This is 2014. He had this great story. He told my friend Kyle, I have a great story, and I really need somebody who can write and who really knows basketball. And my friend Kyle said, I've got just your guy. I've got just your guy. And so that's how I met Isaiah Austin. And that's really why we're here, to talk about Isaiah and to talk about Dream Again. And so I want to tell you a little bit. It's been several years since his story. I think I began working with Isaiah in August of 2014. And in that year, the NBA draft in 2014, Isaiah was one of the biggest stories of the summer. And his story, he was on Good Morning America. It was one of the most inspiring things that I'd ever seen happen at an NBA draft. On draft night, and we're big basketball fans in my family, and so we were watching draft night when this happened before I ever knew that I was going to write Isaiah's book. On draft night, the NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, stood up, and I think it was after the 6th pick of the NBA draft. And if you've never watched the draft, what they do is they'll put the team who's going to select the next player up on the board, and they'll put a clock. Well, after that 6th pick, there was no team up there for a minute, and so you didn't quite know what was going on. And the commissioner of the NBA came up to the microphone, and he stood there for a second, and he said, he started to talk about Isaiah Austin, the 7-foot center from Baylor University. And he shared with the crowd, he shared with America on TV, that Isaiah had been diagnosed with this career-ending disease called Marfan syndrome, that he would never play basketball again. And so I don't know that there was a dry eye in the room at Radio City Music Hall, and I know there wasn't in our living room and in living rooms across America. And then Adam Silver went on to do something that was historic, and it's something that they talked about on SportsCenter, and it just kind of carried the week of news. He said, with the next pick in the NBA draft, and he didn't say team, he said the NBA selects Isaiah Austin. And so this young man from Baylor, who had just found out 5 days earlier that he would never play basketball again, stood up from the table with his family, wiping the tears from his face, and he walked up to that stage, and he shook Adam Silver's hand. And Adam Silver, I found this out later, Isaiah told me later, that evening Adam Silver told Isaiah, he said, listen, your story is so inspiring, you're so inspiring. He said, when you're finished with your school, you have a job with us. I want you to come work for us. But that evening, as we were watching on TV, Isaiah left that stage, and what happens when you're drafted in the NBA? You immediately go backstage, and you start to do these interviews. And Isaiah took the microphone, and he started to talk about his faith. He started to talk about what God had done in his life. He started to say things that inspired people. And the next day, the next few days, he did the circuit of national talk shows. He was on Good Morning America, and it was just a huge story. And so I was very familiar with that when I walked into this story to work with Isaiah. And I want to I'd love for you guys to read the book, and so I don't want to ruin the book for you. But I think it's really important if I'm going to talk about this tonight. And that's the other thing. It's been a couple of years since Isaiah and I worked together. And most of the time as a ghostwriter, you're not the guy that tells the story. Isaiah is the guy that's out there telling the story. So it's a really cool honor. Because as a person, I really like Isaiah as a person, and it's neat to be able to sit here and talk through that experience that we went through together writing the book. I want you to understand that what happened on that draft night, which people say is the neatest thing to ever happen in the NBA draft, what happened on that draft night was no accident. And so I just want to tell you a couple things about his life. And the thing about Isaiah's story is it's more incredible than what I'm going to tell you tonight. When I got in and started to work with Isaiah and I first learned about his story, the thing that appealed to me about it was that there's hundreds of stories about athletes overcoming this injury, overcoming this, and they always win out in the end. You know, they always win the championship. They always do this. That was not Isaiah's story. You see, Isaiah ran into something in his life that he wasn't going to be able to overcome. And that's what made this whole thing interesting. And so, in order to understand him walking across that stage that night and being drafted and shaking hands with the commissioner, that was no accident. And you have to go back to early in his life. And so as I sat down with Isaiah and started to talk to him about his life, I learned that when he was 4 or 5 years old, he would sit around and watch the NBA draft with his dad, Ben. And I don't remember the particular players that he liked. It's been a while since we talked about this. But he watched these guys walk across the stage, and he told me, he said, that was my dream. It wasn't just a dream like I want to be a firefighter or I want to do this. That was my dream, to walk across that stage on draft night. He said, I embraced it. He said, when I went to bed at night, I thought about it, you know. And we laughed. We had fun with it in the book. We said, you know, because we talked about the fact that Isaiah would think about what kind of suit he was going to wear. He would think about how he was going to shake the commissioner's hand, what kind of hat he was going to put on. Was it going to be Boston or L.A.? You know, what was he going to say about his mom and the microphone, you know, after he was drafted, that kind of funny stuff. But it was real to him. He really did that every night. He had that, you know, but he also had a real love for basketball, which is something that you have to have. His mom told me a story that when he was 6 or 7 years old, he would lock himself in the bathroom if the weather was bad so he could dribble around on the tile floor. And she said it drove her nuts. It drove her nuts. But he loved the game that much, and so he had that part of it too. You've got to love what you do. You've got to have a passion about what you do, and he did it at a very young age. And then Isaiah had something that, you know, certainly I didn't and most people don't have, is he had a lot of God-given ability. You know, by the time he was in the 8th grade, I think Isaiah was 6'10". He was a big kid. So that's the first part, to understand that this was a lifelong dream for Isaiah, and it was not a dream like you and I talk about, a dream to drive a certain car or a dream to do this. It was a dream for, he wanted to walk across that stage on draft night. And I think the second thing that you need to understand about that historic draft night, he was the first honorary pick in NBA history. They had never done that before. The second thing to understand probably began when he was in the 8th grade. When he was in the 8th grade in Dallas, he was playing in a championship basketball game, and he was warming up before the game. And this was just Isaiah's personality. The officials were not at the game, and he knew that. And they were playing in the championship, and he kind of wanted to send a message to the other team on the other side of the floor, so he went in and dunked the ball. You're not supposed to do that in warm-ups, but he did it anyway. But when he came down from that dunk, his eye went completely red. He had no idea what was going on. He tried to wipe the blood away, but there was no blood there. His vision was just red. And so he went home that night, and his parents drove him. The next day they took him to see an eye specialist in Dallas. And the eye specialist looked at it, and he said, you know, it looks like your retina is about to detach. The connective tissue behind your eye is not strong, and we've got to go in and repair this, or you're going to lose your vision. And so the doctor told Isaiah, he said, listen, you know, this recovery is going to be bad. The surgery is going to be painful. You're going to have to be on a lot of medication. It's just going to be grueling. And Isaiah told me, as we talked about it, he said, no matter what that doctor said, it could not have prepared me for the pain of that surgery. He said, if you've ever had eye surgery, it's like having millions of needles, you know, shoved into your eye. He said it was that painful. And so he went through this surgery, and the recovery was just as terrible as the doctor had told him it was. He had to lay face down. He couldn't, you know, for a teenager not to be able to use their phone, he couldn't use his phone, couldn't watch TV, had to lay face down on this special cot for several days. It was a long recovery. It kept him away from the things that he loved. It kept him away from the gym. It kept him away from his friends in school. But he got through that. And he started to play again. And at this point, you know, Isaiah was into his freshman year, and people were already talking about Isaiah as one of the best basketball players in America, even as a freshman. They were rating him in the top 20 in America. But it was just a couple of months. They had to go back for that doctor's visit again. And the doctor looked at his eye, and he said, I'm really sorry to tell you this, Isaiah, but the surgery didn't take. We've got to go back in, and we've got to do this whole thing again. And so Isaiah said the emotion of dealing with that one more time was just overwhelming. But of course, he wants to be able to see. And so they went back in, and they did the surgery again. And something happened, and this one, he said, was just as bad as the first one, and the recovery was just as horrible. But something happened this time that would really influence what happened on draft night years later in 2014. His mom would come in every night, and she would put her hand on him, and she would pray over him after she got home from work because he couldn't move. You know, he would have to lay there face down. And he said night after night she would come in and pray for him. And he had grown up in a family. His mom and his dad were both very, very into church. Faith was a big deal in their house. You know, and he was into his freshman year at this point. And he said he thought, if this is who mom goes to when things are bad, then maybe I need to think about this. And so he gave his life to God in one of those nights as she was praying over him. And he began to read the Bible. He began to get involved in his church. He began to pray all the time. He really worked at getting to know God better and trying to understand what that meant for him as a person, and that was a big deal. And so he got through that surgery, started to play for a month or two, and they went back for yet another doctor visit, and the doctor looked at his eye again, and again, he said, hey, it didn't take this time. And Isaiah said, he could tell that his eye was a little cloudy and that maybe something was wrong. And so just the emotion to try to get through this surgery one more time. But he was also very frustrated because in these months, he had been doing everything that Christians are supposed to do. He was going to youth group and he was going to church. And they were praying about this as a family. They were praying that his eye would be fixed, that his eye would be healed. And it wasn't just their family, it was other people. So he had a hard time with this. So he went back into the third surgery, and it was grueling and terrible, everything that the first two were. But they prayed about it, and they were hopeful. He finished that surgery, and I think this was going into his sophomore year. And at this point in Isaiah's basketball career, he was probably rated as one of the top 3 players in America. Colleges from across America were sending letters to him. They started sending him letters in the 7th grade, and so he was highly recruited. They went for another doctor visit, and you can guess what the doctor told him. He said that the surgery didn't take again. And so Isaiah was crushed. And the doctor said, Isaiah, every time that we do this surgery, the chances of it taking go down a little bit more. And I know it's painful. And he said, but I want to try a 4th time. And Isaiah's family got together, and they prayed about it, and they talked about it. And Isaiah made this really tough decision. He told his mom, he said, I can't do this anymore. And so they told the doctor, we're not going to do another surgery. And the doctor said, Isaiah, you need to understand that your eye is going to go completely dead, that you're going to go blind in your right eye. And he did. He was okay with that. And so over the next few months, he lost vision in that eye. And this is, in the book, there's so many parts, because Isaiah had to deal with so much when this happened. When his eye died, it affected the way it looked. And so that was hard to deal with as a high school kid, if you can imagine. But it also, he lost his vision in his right eye. It started to impact his basketball game as well. But not just that, it was the things that we take for granted every day. Isaiah couldn't pour his own glass of water anymore because he had no depth perception in his right eye. He couldn't shake hands with people. He had to learn how to shake hands with people because you had to guess where their hand was. And he said, it took a lot of feeling stupid and just figuring out how to do that. He couldn't walk around his mom's living room if she rearranged the furniture because he couldn't figure out how to get there. This is when he learned how to drive, too, blind in one eye. And I have a 17-year-old, and he drives kind of crazy with 2 good eyes. I can't imagine what it was like, Isaiah's dad teaching him to drive blind in one eye. And so this became a real frustration for him, and it began to affect him on the basketball court. And his mom came to him one evening, and she said something that would also make that draft night special and impact him on that draft night in 2014. She said, Isaiah, I don't know why this has happened. I know we prayed about it. I don't know why God allowed this to happen. But she said, you have 2 choices with this. She said, you can make this your excuse, or you can make this your story. And she said, if you want to make it your excuse, that's okay. You're one of the best basketball players in America. But if you can't get through this and you walk away and you want to find something to do, that's okay. Everybody will say that's okay. You have an excuse. But she said, you can also make it your story. You can own this. You can own this disability. You can work through it. You can make it part of your story. And so Isaiah decided that night that he was going to make it part of his story. And so his high school coach, Coach Ray, he said, Isaiah was always a kid. He was a tenacious worker. He just embraced going to the gym and working hard, but he said he took it to the next level. And he said if he got a phone call before 6 in the morning on a Saturday or in the summer, he knew it was Isaiah wanting to come in and work out. Because he went from shooting 100-some shots a day to shooting thousands. And just through repetition, he began to get better and better. And during this period, Isaiah became the number 1 player in America. He was so good that his parents and the family had talked about this, and there's all these college coaches recruiting him. They decided to kind of keep it a secret. They weren't going to tell anybody that he was blind in one eye because why would you? And so just a few coaches, his high school coach knew, his family knew, but they kind of kept it within the family. They didn't have to tell anybody. And so all of these colleges, University of Kentucky, the best colleges in America, were recruiting Isaiah. He decided to go to the University of Baylor. And I got to spend in the process of writing this book, I got to spend some time with those coaches at Baylor. And Isaiah would tell me later, he said, they have a family atmosphere. These coaches not only care for you, they pray for you. They're there for you. They pray before practice sometimes. They have devotions as a team once a week. And faith was important to Isaiah. He wanted to be a part of that. And after spending a week with the basketball program and Coach Drew and those guys, I found that to be true. It's just a remarkable family atmosphere. And so he committed to go to Baylor. It was close to his family, which he wanted as well. And he had he played played basketball as a freshman at Baylor, and that's another part of the book that's worth picking up and reading, because he dealt with a lot of adversity in that freshman year. But I want to fast forward to the end of his freshman year. He went and told Coach Drew that he was ready to go to the NBA, because he had this vision his whole life, this dream. Every night when he went to bed, he thought about walking across that stage in New York City every night. And he couldn't wait. And so he told Coach Coach Drew at Baylor, he said, I'm leaving. I'm not sure Coach Drew was totally pleased with that at the time, but he said, okay. And so Isaiah left school that spring, and he decided he was going to start working out and enter his name into the NBA draft. And the guys on ESPN, everybody that talks about basketball, they were all saying, oh, he's a sure number one pick. And so if you can imagine this young man, this freshman who's overcome this blindness, all this stuff, he's hearing on TV that he's going to be a number one pick. He's so excited. He thinks he's so close. His dreams are coming true. And so before he ever starts that process of the draft, he was in Dallas and he was working out with his high school coach in the gym. And the high school coach passed him the ball in a simple drill, and he felt something tear in his shoulder and really bothered him. And so they took him to the doctor that night, and the doctor looked at it and just shook his head. He said, I can't believe you did this just passing the basketball. He had torn his shoulder up and he was going to need surgery. It was the connective tissue inside his shoulder. So the doctor told him, you can't go into the NBA. You're going to have major surgery here. It's going to be a 4-month recovery. And so Isaiah had to go back to Baylor, and he had to ask Coach Drew, hey, can I come back for my sophomore year? And Coach Drew said that was good. And he had to work even harder to come back from this injury. And he did that. I think the final thing that shaped Isaiah's story and made that 2014 draft, that historic honorary draft pick thing so important, was his sophomore year at Baylor. And it was a story. It was a story on ESPN that happened his sophomore year at Baylor. He and his family talked during the basketball season, and they decided that it was time for Isaiah to tell the college basketball world that he had been playing blind in one eye. And so it was January 2014 of his sophomore year. It was a Saturday morning on ESPN, and I think my family might have even watched it, so I was familiar with it when it came on. But they did a special, and he explained to America, to college basketball fans, what he had gone through with the surgeries, that he had played blind in his right eye. And all of a sudden, the guys, the talking heads, the basketball experts who had been a little critical of Isaiah, they became Isaiah's biggest fans. Because how does this kid play the way he does? How does he dominate basketball games? And he's blind in one eye. I mean, some of us can't shoot a basketball with two eyes, and this kid's playing with no depth perception. And the scouting reports on Isaiah would say that. I mean, he could pass the ball better than most players. He could rebound the ball better than most players. You couldn't double team him. He'd pass out of it. He was a great communicator. Like, it just wasn't, it was a strength for him. So that was one part of it. But the biggest part of it, it wasn't what all those people were saying. Isaiah explained to me that in the weeks after that ESPN special, he began to get emails, hundreds of emails, from parents of children with sight disabilities, with young people who had sight disabilities, these encouraging emails to Isaiah saying, hey, I want to meet you, you're inspiring to me. And Isaiah began to realize that basketball wasn't just about his dream anymore. It was a platform to inspire people. He had young kids showing up at his game and wearing his jersey at this point, wanting him to sign autographs. He got out in the community and started working with kids who were dealing with the same kind of disability that he was dealing with. And so it was a huge deal for him. It was a maturing moment where he realized that, as a basketball player, I have an opportunity to share my faith with people, to really impact their lives, to encourage them through difficult circumstances. And that was ultimately something that would carry him through what would happen 5 days before that draft. Now let me tell you just for a minute what made the 2014 draft so special. So at the end of his sophomore year, Isaiah's team did great. They finished in the Sweet 16. Isaiah went and talked to Scott Drew, the head coach at Baylor, and said, this is my time. I'm going to go. I'm going to declare for the NBA. Everybody was really behind him and really happy for him. And so he went to Chicago. You have to go to Chicago to do the NBA Combine, and that's where they measure how tall you are and how high you can jump and how fast you are and that kind of thing. And so he went to Chicago, and this was the first year in the history of the NBA that they had ever done genetic testing at the NBA Combine, a certain kind of genetic testing. And they did it in 2014, and Isaiah was flagged for this disease called Marfan syndrome. He was flagged for it. He went out and continued to work out for teams across the country and didn't hear anything about it for a couple of weeks. And so 5 days before the draft, he flew back to Dallas, and he met his high school coach one Saturday morning, 5 days before the draft, and he got a couple text messages from his agent. And his agent, Dwan, told him, hey, we are definitely a first-round pick. You know, he said there's two teams, and one is going to be at about 15, another one's in the 20s, but they both want to take you. You are going to be a first-round pick. And so Isaiah was up here. I mean, he was so excited. He was celebrating. He spent the day with his high school coach, and at the end of the day, his high school coach drove him to his aunt and uncle's house in Dallas. And when I was doing book research with Isaiah, I had the opportunity to meet his aunt and uncle and go in the house and walk into their foyer and sit in the living room, where he went that evening. He went to their house, and they pulled up outside, and he stayed with his aunt and uncle sometimes. And so he looked around, and he realized there were 30-some cars. There were some in the driveway. There were some in the street. He realized that something was up. And again, he's flying sky high. This dream he's had since he was a little kid, it's about to come true. In 5 days, it's going down. And so the thought crossed his mind, maybe we're having a little bit of an early celebration. Maybe that's what's going to happen. And so he walked in to the living room, and Coach Ray, his coach, is kind of a bigger guy, actually stood behind Isaiah, I think to make sure that he couldn't leave. And Isaiah looked around the living room, and he saw the entire coaching staff from Baylor was there, because that's what those guys do. Coach Drew, Coach Tang, Coach Mills, they were there. His pastor was there. His high school mentor was a guy named Coach Pops, just a wonderful guy, was a deacon in a church. I think he'd been a pastor at one point. He was there. Isaiah looked around, and all the people who had loved him through his life were in this room. And then he looked at his mom. He saw that his mom was crying, and he knew something was wrong. And she looked at him, and I think she said, I'm sorry. And what happened that evening, they called the NBA doctors, and they got the NBA doctors on the speakerphone so Isaiah could hear. And the NBA doctor told Isaiah, when you were in Chicago, you tested positive for this disease called Marfan syndrome. And he said it impacts the connective tissue throughout your body. And he said, listen, you're lucky to have survived playing college basketball with this disease. But he said the NBA it's a faster game, it's a more intense game, it's a more physical game, and this disease is affecting your heart. And he said you cannot play professional basketball. You would die on the court if that happened. And so here in this living room, Isaiah finds out that this thing that he's dreamed about since he was a little kid, that it's over. There's no way out of it. And he kind of falls down and he's crying a little bit. And one of the coolest things for me as a ghostwriter is to be able to walk into somebody's life and come alongside them, because we're not always good at seeing our own stories. We're not even good at telling our own stories sometimes. And I can see sometimes how God worked in people's lives even when they can't. And I talked to everyone who was in the room that night, and there was not one person who could recount that scene to me without coming to tears. I mean, I was in the Baylor coach. Every one of the Baylor coaches, when we talked about it, they were in tears recounting this evening. Because Isaiah's on the floor, and he's thinking, this is what I've worked for my whole life. I overcame blindness. I've overcome all of this adversity, and now it's taken away. And the room began to sing a Kirk Franklin song, and they were led by Coach Pops. And they began to pray over Isaiah in this moment. And Coach Pops began to lead the prayer. And they gathered around him, and they put their hands on him. And Isaiah said, and I've seen a little bit of this video, Isaiah said that as Coach Pops prayed, he prayed, God, please help Isaiah dream again. He said something like, you're a God that takes broken dreams and makes them whole again. Please help Isaiah dream again. And Isaiah said he heard that, and he said he thought about his life, And he thought about those moments fighting through that blindness. And he thought about what his mom had told him. You have a choice. You can make this your excuse, or you can make this your story. And he said he looked at his little brother and sister, and he thought about those kids in college when he had shared his story. He had carried this blindness with him all those years, and he had shared it with people. And he thought about those little kids who had reached out to him, and he thought about the influence that he had in people's lives. And he said, I've got to get up off this floor for my brother and sister, for the kids out there who are looking to me, for the people out there who are facing difficulty in their life and looking to me for some kind of encouragement. I've got to get up off this floor. And that's what he did, and it was not easy. And it wasn't easy for him a month or so later when I was working with him on the book. But he got up off the floor that night, and they continued to pray, and they continued to support Isaiah. And the next morning, you can see this on YouTube, the next morning Isaiah went on ESPN with a family friend, Holly Rowe, and she flew into Dallas, and he shared with the world on ESPN his diagnosis. And there were a couple reasons for that. They wanted to get out in front of the story so everybody understood clearly what had happened to Isaiah. That was part of it. But the other part of it was Isaiah and his mom had talked about this. And Marfan's can be very dangerous if it goes undiagnosed. And there's not a lot of awareness about the disease. And they both felt like if Isaiah would get on TV and talk about this, that it would raise awareness about the disease. And if you watch that interview, he's very emotional. It's a very painful interview to watch. He was still dealing with the grief of that, and yet he did that anyway. Later that day, he got a call from, the family got a call from Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, and he told them, hey, listen, we understand what's happened, and I think he might have been calling to give his condolences, but he said, I know Isaiah has friends. He had some friends that were going to be drafted in that NBA draft, Corey Jefferson and some other guys. And they said, we'd really like you and the family to come. We have a table for you. We'd like Isaiah to go through everything that he would have gone through had he been drafted. And so Isaiah and his family talked about it, and they accepted the invitation to do that. But they just didn't want to go to New York just for that. And so his mom began to reach out to the Marfan's Foundation that raises money for Marfan's research and raises awareness for that. And they set up a meeting with them. And they began to arrange interviews so that Isaiah could get on the radio and talk about his Marfan's diagnosis. And so that leads us to New York when he walks across that stage. And that's one of the neat things about being a ghostwriter, is we got to watch that in our living room on television. And there wasn't a dry eye in our room. It was inspiring to watch the way he handled that. Isaiah took the microphone after that, and he talked about his faith, and he talked about wanting to help people dream again. He talked about wanting to help people out of their own difficult situations. And I think Isaiah would say, and I think he did say as we worked through this, that as he looks back on it now, he sees how God was working through his story, And that's something as a ghostwriter that I get to see with people, which is really neat. But he told me, he said, that injury that I had as a freshman, when I thought my dream was this close, and I hurt my shoulder, he said, if I would have gone into the draft that year, the NBA didn't test for Marfan's disease. They didn't do it. They'd never done it before. So he would have been drafted in the NBA and could have died on the basketball court. And so he looks back at that, and that's a faith thing for Isaiah, He's also said to me as we've talked, and I know even to this day, Isaiah is a competitor, and if he could be playing in the NBA, he would love to do that, I know it. But he's also said that the influence that he has to impact people and to share his faith and to change people's lives has grown immensely because of what he went through with this Marfan's diagnosis. So it was a really neat, really inspiring story, and that's just the big parts of Dream Again. There's a lot more in there. So.
That's right.
And he's a neat young man. He really is. So.
What is he doing
now? He is in Los Angeles, and it's been a while since we've worked on this book, and so I'm not exactly sure what he's up to there. So I know he's doing well. So
you don't know his diagnosis now, how much
No, I know. The remarkable thing about this story, and again, and this is something I forgot to mention, but because of Isaiah Austin and because of the way he chose to handle these things in his life, and because of that moment at the NBA draft, he was able to raise more money for Marfan's research than anyone in the history of the disease. And I think he continues to work to do that. And so, and I think everybody's hopeful that at some point he could play again, but I don't know what the odds are of that. But I know that that's one of his missions. He's a part of that group, and he's out there raising money for them. So
you may have mentioned this, and I missed it, but did he contact you to write with him, or did you contact Isaiah?
Well, the way that worked, Isaiah had a literary agent.
Their people talked.
Yeah. Yeah, well, a friend of mine. I had a friend. I actually had a friend who had coffee with his literary agent, because at that point, I think when I signed on for the Isaiah project, it was a huge story still. People were still kind of buzzing about what had happened at the draft because it had never happened before. And the thing is, the great thing people don't realize is Isaiah was going to make history anyway. He was going to be the first. He was going to be the first ever NBA draft pick with that kind of sight impairment. I mean, ever, or maybe any. And so he was going to make history one way or the other. But the story was phenomenal. People were still talking about it, and he already had a literary agent, and just kind of made a connection with one of my friends. And my friend knew my background with basketball and said, I know this guy would love this book. So it worked out pretty neat. So I knew a little bit about his story. I knew a little bit about his blindness before I ever came into it. But the experience for me as a former basketball player and basketball coach to be able to, fly down to Baylor and spend that time with those coaches at Baylor are just remarkable guys, and to be able to hang out in their offices and be around the players. And I'll tell you, one of the neatest things, when you work with different people to help them tell their story, you get to stand back and observe. And let me tell you, my first several days observing Isaiah, this is the guy who had lost his dream of playing basketball. That next year, he was kind of a student manager for the basketball program. And one of the coaches, I think it was Coach Mills, told me, he said, Matt, he said, it doesn't matter who we play this season, and this would have been the 2014-2015 season. Isaiah was on the bench that year with the team. He said, it doesn't matter who we play, Isaiah will always be the best player in the gym. And yet I watched him at practice, and you know what he was doing? He was wiping up sweat from the floor for his teammates. He was bringing water to his teammates. He would get some of the guys that played for Baylor this year, great guys. Isaiah would get those guys to the gym real early to work out, and I mean, he'd work them out hard. I mean, he was really focused on building into other people and building into his teammates. And so I immediately, when I got around him, I thought, this guy's fantastic. So I really liked Isaiah. He's a good dude. So.
How did you find the process of telling his story and deciding which details to include? Create the story arc. Was that hard?
Oh, there are. I find, and I'm finding this true in a project that I was just working on. I find that sometimes real life, it really is better than fiction. Like, you couldn't build a better narrative arc. I mean, you couldn't build better twists and turns, because one of the things I love about, maybe it's just me, one of the things I love about ghostwriting is it's a constant reminder that our life is not accidental, and I constantly get to see God working in people's lives in ways that they don't even realize, and that's really cool. So.
Do you start with that night and then work back?
In this particular, yeah, not every story works like that, but with this particular story, I start with the evening that he finds out he'll never play basketball again, and then I work my way back from the beginning. So you kind of feel like, oh my gosh, what's he going to do? And then you learn the background of the story, because the background's really incredible. Just the adversity that he faced to build his character and to be able to deal with this. And Isaiah is still a very young man. I mean, he's still figuring life out, I'm sure. But his ability, and this came from his family too, but his ability to focus on what was best for other people. And he had an innate toughness that a lot of these athletes have. And the other thing that I loved about this is especially for kids, especially for young athletes a lot of times think that these guys are just big and tall and they just show up. And I'll tell you, I mean, to be around these guys, and especially to be around Isaiah and to see his work ethic, you have to have a real passion for what you do, and you have to have the work ethic to go with it, really. So, it's neat.
The Mockingbird Parables wasn't a ghostwriting. That was all you, right?
Yeah.
So which do you prefer?
Oh, I really like both. I really like both. I enjoy, the writing is kind of a solitary thing, and so the ghostwriting thing offers me an opportunity to work with other people, which as a former educator, and I still love the classroom, I still love teaching. I didn't leave teaching because of that. And so ghostwriting gives me an opportunity to work with people and kind of help them, and sometimes I do all the writing, and sometimes I just do a little bit of the managing and helping, and so that's a collaborative process, and I really enjoy that part of it. So, but there's a space too. I bet there's something about starting with that blank page and writing your own thing, and doing the discovery and building a book out of nothing. That's exciting too. So, when you work with a person, you have a place to start, really, and so that's a little bit of a difference.
Any other questions?
Is this your first ghostwriting project?
It was my first. So I think I think I'll be starting my fifth this spring. So it's been a neat process.
Your fifth ghostwriting?
Yeah.
Okay. Where's some
There's one that's coming out in 2017, and I had one that ended up being a bestseller. But as a ghostwriter, you can't talk about all your projects. I love the fact. I really do enjoy when I can have my name on the book, but you can't always do that. And honestly, at the end of the day, it's not that big a deal. I mean, it doesn't take away from the process. The thing is, that's one thing about writing books is just like anything else. It's just like playing basketball. It's not the win that's the fun part; it's the actual playing. And so I found that if I don't get credit, I still enjoy the game and the process of doing it. And so that's one of the things I like about ghostwriting. So. And you don't have to worry with the platform and the promotion and a lot of other things that come with that.
So is this the only one of your books that you can actually say that you bought, like your
I have a book coming out in January 2017 that I just finished, and it is a basketball book. It's called Coach 'Em Up, and it is actually I don't know how much I can talk about it, but the focus of the book is to kind of get away from the madness of youth sports and return sports to what's best for the athlete. And of course, I mean, I coached for 10 years in the organization that I worked with, Kaz McCaslin. The book is by Kaz McCaslin. He's the president of Upward Sports, and he is just a fantastic human being. And I really enjoyed working through that book process with him. But that'll come out in January 2017. And that book allowed me the opportunity, which again, as a sports fan, and I wouldn't want to write sports books all the time. But I had the opportunity to work with Coach Steve Alford at UCLA and Coach Mark Richt at Miami. He made a contribution. Rick Barnes at the University of Tennessee, and the guy from CBS. So some really neat personalities, because everybody kind of looks at youth sports and what's going on with competition, and they see that there's something wrong with it, and so there's a real need for this, and so that one's going to be really fun. And so the other thing about the book process is it's just such a long process, and so I think Isaiah and I started in 2014. The book came out in 2015, an entire year later. Another neat part of that process was working with RG3, Robert Griffin III. Worked with him to write the foreword, which was pretty cool. So he was a great guy as well. But it's fun to have the opportunity to talk to some of the guys we see playing sports.